They called him the Chikatilo of Kamensk, a quiet, forgettable man from a small industrial town who moved through the streets like a shadow, carrying plastic bags, walking past playgrounds and courtyards where children played. Nobody looked twice at him. Nobody understood that inside that ordinary, tired body lived one of the most dangerous predators in modern Russian criminal history. Between 1993 and 1996, 6 children disappeared in Kamensk Shakhtinsky, a town in the Rostov region. 5 girls and 1 boy. They vanished on their way home near dumps by the riverbank, in places that seemed so familiar that nobody imagined those locations could become execution sites. Parents warned their kids not to talk to strangers, but the danger was not a stranger. It was a neighbor. It was a man who knew the yards, the shortcuts, the abandoned corners of the town better than anyone else. The first time the town truly realized that something was terribly wrong was when 2 children from the same family disappeared together. That alone should have been enough to trigger alarms at every level, from local police to regional leadership. But the 1990s in Russia were a time of chaos. The state was weak, the police were overwhelmed, and criminals of all types were taking advantage of the confusion. In that environment, even the disappearance of 2 siblings could dissolve into rumors and uncertainty. By the time investigators were ready to say the words serial killer, the killer himself already had years of experience. He had selected victims, eliminated witnesses, raped and killed, and then carefully hidden his crimes. Only much later would forensic psychiatrists say that this man, Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev, was one of the most organized child murderers they had ever seen. This is not just the story of a killer. It is the story of how a town failed to see the danger living in its own courtyards, and how a quiet man used that blindness to hunt in plain sight. This is the story of Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev, the Chikatilo of Kamensk. To understand how someone like Roman Burtsev could operate for years without being caught, you have to understand where and when he lived. Kamensk Shakhtinsky is a small industrial town in Rostov Oblast. It grew around factories, mines, and the infrastructure of the Soviet era. For decades, life there was hard but predictable. People went to work, kids played outside, and the system, for all its flaws, created a sense of order. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. The early 1990s brought economic crisis, unemployment, crime, and a general feeling that nobody was really in control anymore. Institutions that once felt stable suddenly looked weak. Police departments were underfunded, overworked, and often demoralized. The systems for tracking crimes, sharing information, and coordinating investigations were lagging far behind the reality on the streets. In towns like Kamensk Shakhtinsky, this meant one thing: people relied on themselves and on each other more than on the state. Children still walked alone to school, still played in courtyards and vacant lots, still wandered along the riverbank. Parents were busy trying to survive financially. They did not have the time, or sometimes the option, to escort their children everywhere. Trust in the familiar environment was the default. For a predator, this was ideal. The town had many semi-abandoned places, dumps, overgrown paths, old industrial areas, and quiet corners near the river. Lighting in many areas was poor. There were no CCTV cameras, no mobile phones with GPS, no social media where a missing child's photo could spread in minutes. If a child disappeared, the first reaction might be confusion, denial, or hope that the child would come back on their own. This is the landscape in which Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev grew up and later hunted, a place where everyone thought they knew each other, and where that illusion of safety became his greatest ally. Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev was born on April 13, 1971, in the Rostov region. From the outside, his childhood did not look special or unusually traumatic in ways that would immediately mark him as a future serial killer. People who later spoke about him described a quiet, somewhat withdrawn boy who did not stand out. He was not the class clown, not the star student, not the troublemaker. He was easy to overlook. In psychological terms, that forgettability is important. Many serial killers rely on being invisible in everyday life. They are not necessarily charismatic leaders or loud eccentrics. They are ordinary neighbors who notice everything while being noticed by no one. That seems to have been the case with Burtsev. His face did not stick in people's memories. His manner was not threatening. He blended into the gray background of the town. As he grew older, he did not develop a big career or public profile. There are no reports of him becoming a successful professional, a well-known local personality, or an open troublemaker. He drifted through life in the way many people did in the 1990s, working, surviving, staying mostly in the same area where he had always lived. This kept him close to the streets, yards, and back paths he had known since childhood. What went on inside his mind during these years can only be reconstructed indirectly. But looking at his later crimes, it is clear that he spent a long time observing. He learned the rhythms of town life, when children walked to school, when they came back, which routes they preferred, and where adults were least likely to be watching. That long, quiet observation would later become the foundation of his murders. By the time he committed his first known killing, he did not behave like someone experimenting for the first time. He acted like someone who had rehearsed these moments many times in his imagination and was now putting his private script into action. On September 15, 1993, 12-year-old Yevgeny Churilov and his 7-year-old sister Olesya disappeared. They were last seen near a dump in the Zavodsky settlement of Kamensk Shakhtinsky, a place that many residents knew but avoided if they could. For the children, it was just part of their environment. For Roman Burtsev, it was an ideal hunting ground. His real target that day was Olesya, the younger sister. She fit his pattern, a young child, vulnerable, easy to control physically. But she was not alone. Yevgeny was with her, and that created a problem for the killer. A single victim could be taken and hidden. 2 children meant a witness, a potential source of identification, a threat to his anonymity. Burtsev decided to eliminate the threat first. He attacked the 12-year-old boy with his fists, then with a metal plate he found nearby. He struck Yevgeny in the head repeatedly until the boy stopped moving. This was not a panicked, chaotic assault. It was a deliberate decision. Remove the witness, then focus on the primary victim. With the brother dead or dying, he turned to the 7-year-old girl. He raped and then strangled Olesya, completing the pattern of sexual violence and murder that would define his crimes. When both children were dead, he dragged their bodies to a garbage pit and covered them, effectively erasing the crime from casual view. For the Churilov family, the children had simply vanished. There were no bodies, no obvious crime scene, no clear explanation. For investigators, it was an immediate crisis. 2 children missing at once is rare and alarming. But without physical evidence, without witnesses who saw the attack, the case started on the hardest possible setting. The killer had chosen his location and method well. The disappearance of the Churilov siblings shook Kamensk Shakhtinsky. Parents began warning their children to stay close to home. Rumors spread through stairwells and workplaces, and the idea that something terrible had happened became impossible to ignore. 2 children do not simply vanish without a trace, yet the absence of bodies created a strange psychological vacuum. When there is no physical proof of murder, human minds search for alternatives. Some people thought the children might have run away. Others suspected abduction, perhaps even trafficking to another region. In the unstable reality of the 1990s, every frightening scenario felt plausible. The police opened an investigation, but they were working in the dark. There were no surveillance cameras, no mobile phone data, no strong forensics from a well-preserved crime scene. The dump area was dirty, chaotic, full of old trash and random objects. Even if officers walked close to the burial site, there was no guarantee they would notice anything suspicious. Meanwhile, the killer watched. For him, the disappearance of 2 children with no immediate consequences was a twisted success. He had killed, hidden the bodies, and returned to normal life. He saw the fear, the confusion, the inability of the system to quickly respond. That knowledge is incredibly dangerous in the mind of a predator. It confirms what he wanted to believe, that he could act again. In that moment, the town of Kamensk Shakhtinsky and Roman Burtsev entered into a deadly relationship. The town did not know it yet, but the pattern had already begun. After the double murder, nearly a year passed before the next known crime. This gap is common in serial killers. The first murders are followed by a so-called cooling-off period, where the offender processes what he has done, relives it in memory and fantasy, and gradually feels the urge to repeat it. When he acts again, it is usually with greater confidence and refinement. On July 17, 1994, 12-year-old Marina Alexeyeva disappeared. She would later be recognized as Burtsev's 3rd victim. The pattern now had a clear shape. A preteen girl, approached and taken in an area that gave the killer control and privacy. He raped and murdered her, then concealed her body. Once again, the child did not come home. Once again, there was fear, but no evidence strong enough to reveal the killer. Less than a year later, on May 23, 1995, he struck again. This time, the victim was 9-year-old Anya Kulinkina. He abducted her and took her to the bank of the Donets River, a place that should have been peaceful, even beautiful. For generations, the river had been a normal part of local life. But under Burtsev's control, it became another crime scene. On the riverbank, he repeated his pattern: sexual assault, followed by murder. Then he concealed the body. Water, tall grass, and isolated spots along the bank gave him many options for hiding his crimes. To the casual eye, the river flowed as always. Only later would investigators understand how many secrets its shores were keeping. By this point, the disappearance of children in Kamensk Shakhtinsky could no longer be treated as a series of unrelated tragedies. There was a cluster: 2 siblings in 1993, a 12-year-old girl in 1994, a 9-year-old girl in 1995. Different families, same region, similar ages. The idea of a serial predator was no longer just a dark rumor. It was becoming the only explanation that made sense. In 1996, the pace of killings increased. For many serial killers, the time between murders, known as the interval, shrinks as their psychological addiction to the crime deepens. The planning remains, but the internal brakes start to fail. That's exactly what seems to have happened with Roman Burtsev. On July 1, 1996, he abducted and murdered 9-year-old Ira Ternovskaya. Sadly, much of the public detail of her final moments mirrors the pattern of his previous crimes: a sudden attack, sexual assault, and murder, followed by careful concealment of the body. For the town, it was one more disappearance, one more child who did not come home. Just 2 weeks later, on July 16th, he killed again. This time, his victim was 12-year-old Natasha Kurbabina. 2 murders in the space of 15 days marked a dramatic escalation. The compulsive drive had intensified to the point where he was no longer content to wait months between attacks. Even in this escalation, however, his method remained organized. He continued to choose locations that gave him control, continued to eliminate physical evidence as best he could, and continued to hide the bodies. Almost all of the victims remained undiscovered until he personally led investigators to them after his arrest. It was this combination, rising urgency and consistent concealment, that made him so hard to catch. By mid-July 1996, 6 children were gone: Yevgeny, Olesya, Marina, Anya, Ira, and Natasha. The pattern was undeniable. What the police needed was not another disappearance, but a mistake. And eventually, Burtsev made one. For 3 years, Roman Burtsev had been successful in the most horrifying sense of the word. He killed children and walked away unnoticed. What broke that streak was not advanced technology or a dramatic undercover operation. It was a small human moment, a request for a tool. After one of his murders, he approached an elderly woman who lived nearby and asked her for a spade. He needed it to bury a body. At the time, she had no idea what the tool was going to be used for. To her, it was just a favor to a man who did not seem particularly dangerous. She lent him the spade, and life went on. Later, during the investigation, this woman's memory became crucial. She remembered him. She remembered that he had asked for the spade, and she described him to the authorities. In a sea of fear and rumors, her testimony was a solid piece of real information. It connected a specific person to suspicious behavior near the time and place of a child's disappearance. Around the same period, another important piece of evidence emerged. A girl whom Burtsev had tried and failed to abduct gave her own description of the man who had approached her. She survived the encounter and was able to tell investigators what he looked like. Her account, combined with the elderly woman's memory, turned the idea of a faceless predator into the outline of a real, identifiable person. For 3 years, his invisibility had been his shield. Now, for the first time, that shield cracked. On July the 17th, 1996, exactly 3 years after the murder of Marina Alexeyeva, police arrested Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev. He was no longer just a rumor or a composite sketch in investigators' minds. He was in custody, facing questions that could no longer be avoided. Once detained, he confessed to the murders. This confession was not just a legal formality. It was the key to finding the bodies that had been hidden for years. Without his cooperation, some of his victims might never have been recovered. He agreed to lead investigators to the places where he had disposed of his victims. Guided by Burtsev, police and forensic teams went to dumps, overgrown lots, and riverbank areas around Kamensk Shakhtinsky. There, beneath trash, soil, and vegetation, they uncovered the remains of the children whose names had haunted the town: the Churilov siblings, Marina, Anya, Ira, and Natasha. Each discovery confirmed not only his guilt, but also the disturbing effectiveness of his concealment methods. For the families, these moments were unbearable and necessary at the same time. They finally had answers to the question that had been tearing them apart. Where is my child? But those answers came in the form of bodies retrieved from shallow graves. There was closure, but it was the harsh, cold closure of confirmed death. The town that had once lived in anxious uncertainty now faced the full reality of what had happened within its borders. The nameless monster had a face and a name: Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev. After his arrest, like many serious violent offenders in Russia, Burtsev underwent psychiatric evaluation. Authorities needed to determine whether he was mentally competent and legally sane, or whether he suffered from a condition that would change how he could be judged and punished. Among those who examined him was the well-known forensic psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky, who had also evaluated other notorious serial killers. Burtsev tried to present himself as mentally ill, hoping that this might lead to a less severe outcome. But the experts were not convinced. Their conclusion was clear: he was sane. He understood what he was doing, he knew that it was wrong, and he took active steps to avoid detection. There was no psychotic break that could explain his actions as the result of delusion. Bukhanovsky reportedly described him as one of the most organized murderers he had encountered. Unlike killers who leave chaotic scenes or trophies behind, Burtsev's main concern was making his crimes disappear. He did not want to be famous. He wanted to be untouchable. His methodical burial of victims, choice of remote or dirty locations, and calm behavior after the killings all supported this assessment. From a psychological perspective, this makes the case even more disturbing. It is easier, in some ways, to think of monsters as insane, out of touch with reality. In Burtsev's case, the reality is different. He was fully aware, fully responsible, and fully in control of his actions. His evil was not the product of confusion. It was the product of cold, rational decision-making applied to horrific goals. For the court and for society, that distinction mattered. It meant he would be judged not as a patient to be treated, but as a criminal to be punished. In court, the evidence against Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev was overwhelming. His confession, the discovery of the bodies in locations he indicated, and the pattern of disappearances all converged into a single, horrifying narrative. He was convicted of multiple counts of rape and murder of children. Given the brutality and systematic nature of his crimes, the court initially sentenced him to death. At that time, the death penalty still existed in Russian law, and for a killer like Burtsev, it seemed like the natural outcome in the eyes of many observers. However, Russia was gradually moving toward a de facto moratorium on executions, and death sentences were increasingly being commuted to life imprisonment. This is what happened in his case as well. Instead of facing a firing squad, Burtsev was sent to serve a life sentence in a special regime prison. Sources indicate that he was held in the infamous White Swan prison in Solikamsk, one of the most secure and strict facilities in the country, known for housing some of Russia's most dangerous criminals. For a man who once controlled the lives and deaths of children on the streets of Kamensk Shakhtinsky, the extreme isolation and rigid routine of this prison became his final environment. There, he was no longer a hunter. He was an inmate, stripped of power, watched constantly, and surrounded by concrete, steel, and other men who had committed their own terrible crimes. Whatever fantasies had driven him during his years of killing now had no outlet beyond his own mind. In prison, Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev did not become a dark celebrity. There were no widely known dramatic interviews where he tried to justify himself or boast about what he had done. Instead, the available records paint a picture of gradual physical decline. He reportedly wrote letters to a charity organization called the Russian Birch Foundation, asking for help with medications. In those letters, he complained about hemorrhoids, prostatitis, vitamin deficiency, varicose veins, and fungal infections. The man who had once held children's lives in his hands was now begging for basic medical support. His body, which he had used as a weapon, was failing him. This does not erase his crimes or balance any moral scales, but it does strip away the aura of dark power that often surrounds serial killers in popular culture. In the end, he was just another aging prisoner, trapped in a cell, dependent on others, even for pain relief. Sources report that he died in prison, with one date mentioned as December 2023. There was no spectacle, no public last words, only an entry in official records that one more life had ended behind bars. For the families of his victims, his death did not bring back their children. It did not heal the wounds that had been open since the early 1990s. But it did put a final period in the story of the man who had stolen so much from them. Today, in Kamensk Shakhtinsky, new generations grow up, many of them unaware that their town was once the hunting ground of a serial child killer. The yards have changed, some dumps have been cleaned, and the 1990s are already distant history. Yet among those who remember, the name Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev still carries a heavy, cold weight. It is a reminder that the most dangerous threat is not always a stranger from outside, but sometimes the quiet man walking the same streets as everyone else. When I look at the story of Roman Vladimirovich Burtsev, what strikes me most is not only the cruelty of one man, but the silence around him. This was not a killer who operated in some distant, anonymous metropolis. He walked the same small streets every day, passed the same courtyards, saw the same children, and for years, nobody realized what he was doing. In my opinion, this case shows how dangerous our trust in normality can be. We often imagine monsters as obvious, loud, visibly insane. But Burtsev was the opposite, gray, quiet, forgettable. That is exactly what allowed him to move freely. The town was not ready to suspect someone who looked so ordinary, and that blindness cost lives. For me, the most frightening detail is how carefully he hid his victims. He did not just kill, he tried to erase what he had done. He buried bodies in dumps and remote corners, knowing that in the chaos of the 1990s, the system simply did not have the strength to find them quickly. That is not madness. That is cold, calculated control. I also think this story raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility. It is easy to say that everything is the killer's fault, and legally that is true. But there is also the reality of underfunded police, weak institutions, and a society that was busy surviving day to day. In that environment, predators like Burtsev had an advantage. The system was too slow, and children paid the price. Personally, I believe that the only healthy way to remember cases like this is not through fascination with the killer, but through focus on the victims and the lessons. 6 children lost their lives: Yevgeny, Olesya, Marina, Anya, Ira, and Natasha. Their names should not be just part of a criminal statistic. They are the reason this story matters. If there is one conclusion to draw, it is this: real evil often hides behind an ordinary face. Protecting children is not only about warning them of strangers in dark alleys. It is also about paying attention to the quiet, uncomfortable signs close to home and demanding that institutions do their job, even when the country is in crisis. Cases like Roman Burtsev's should not just scare us, they should wake us up.